I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest military, political and diplomatic updates, and we discuss in detail the situation on the front lines with friend of the podcast, Kyiv Independent Reporter Francis Farrell, who's recently returned from a reporting trip near Toretsk in Donbas.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 5th of August, 2 years and 168 days since the full-scale invasion began. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. On the front line, Russia said its soldiers have seized Novoselivka Pasha, a village in the Pokrovsk direction in Donbas. This would be the latest in a string of advances in the region in the last few weeks. Russian military bloggers also claimed that its soldiers have planted a flag on the T-0504 highway that runs from the town of Konstantinivka, south of Chasiv Yar, to Bakhmut, a route that Ukrainian officials have previously described as critical. We have not been able to independently verify that claim, it must be said. Reports have also said that in the battered town of Chasiv Yar, Russian soldiers have breached a canal that runs through its centre and fighting is ongoing. As James Kilner, foreign correspondent, writes for the Telegraph, quote, Chasiv Yar is considered a key target for the Russian army as it lies on high ground above a valley that connects three towns used by the Ukrainians as organisational hubs for its military. Strategists have said that if Chasiv Yar falls, the Ukrainian front line will become far more fragile, as the Russian military will dominate and shell the towns below. In Russia, reports have come in that Ukraine has destroyed a Russian Su-34 fighter bomber aircraft and an ammunition depot at the Morozovsk airfield in Rostov Oblast on August the 3rd. This claim was made by Ukraine's military intelligence, citing satellite imagery. They also claimed that two other Su-34s were probably damaged by debris. The Kyiv Independent notes that prior to this, the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces confirmed the attack on the Russian airfield, saying also that an ammunition depot storing glide bombs was hit. To the south, Ukraine claims to have sunk a $300 million Russian submarine capable of launching Caliber cruise missiles that is believed to have been going under repairs after a strike on it last year. It said the Rostov-on-Don, a Kilo-class submarine, was hit during a bombardment in occupied Crimea on Friday evening. Using long-range US ATACMS missiles, Ukraine destroyed several air defence systems and the Rostov-on-Don, that's the name of the submarine. Ukraine's Ministry of Defence said, a Russian submarine went to the bottom of the Black Sea. Great work, warriors. The Black Sea fish will enjoy their new home. The Rostov-on-Don was one of 4 submarines operated by Russia's Black Sea fleet. Reporting on this, again, James Kilner, who's of course a regular on this podcast, writes, its demise will likely fuel concerns among Russian authorities that spies are tipping off Ukrainian commanders on the best moments to attack. Kilner also got comment from H.I. Sutton, an independent naval analyst, who said, quote, the submarine was hit by storm shadows last year. Since then, it was moved to a separate berth where it remained vulnerable to a follow-up attack. Contrary to some reporting, it hadn't been fully repaired, but this attack should close the chapter. Just some context, Russia's Kilo-class submarines were originally designed in the Soviet Union, but the program was updated in the 1990s and several more were built throughout the 2000s. They're diesel-powered and considered the most reliable submarines in the Kremlin's fleet, having been used to fire missiles from the Black Sea and Ukrainian cities. The initial strike on the Rostov-on-Don last September infuriated Vladimir Putin, who sacked the commander of the Black Sea Fleet and ordered sailors to be given extra drills on how to defend against missile and drone attacks. Moving on. Ukraine has received its first batch of US-made F-16 fighter jets. This is obviously from Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, who said on Sunday that more are needed to beat back the Russian forces. Zelensky said, we have often heard the word impossible. Now it is a reality. Reality in our skies. F-16s in Ukraine. We made it happen. Mr. Zelensky was standing in front of what looked like 2 grey, partially covered F-16s branded with the Ukrainian trident in a location reporters were asked not to disclose for security reasons. Going on, Zelensky said, I am proud of all of our guys who are mastering these aircraft and have started using them for our country. Zelensky did not say how many jets had been delivered and declined to comment on the specific tasks, but AFP journalists saw at least 2 F-16s on the spot. As we said, Zelensky also immediately warned that more were needed. Quote, our partners know that the number of F-16s we have in Ukraine, the number of pilots who have already been trained, is not enough. The good news is that we are expecting additional F-16s. Several NATO countries have pledged to supply varying numbers of the fighter jets and have been training Ukrainian pilots and crew for months. Our crews are training a lot, Mr. Zelensky said, thanking Denmark, the Netherlands, the US and other allies. Just some notes on the wider context here. During an interview with AFP in May, Zelensky said that Ukraine needed around 130 F-16s to secure parity with Russian air power. Ukraine's partners, however, have promised to send less than 100 F-16s to date, with most likely to arrive over several years following substantial pilot training. Staying with Zelensky and Ukraine, Zelensky told journalists on August the 4th that Kyiv will discuss with NATO the creation of a coalition of countries to help shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine's territory. This is coming from Interfax Ukraine. Poland and Hungary have previously launched scrambled fighter jets to protect their airspace as Russian forces launched large-scale aerial attacks on Ukraine, but the aircraft have never been used to destroy these targets. Zelensky said, "We must work on the technical possibility of using combat aircraft from neighbouring countries against Russian missiles that hit Ukraine in the direction of our neighbours, foremost the countries of the alliance. I want to try this tool so that NATO countries can discuss with Ukraine the possibility of such a small coalition of neighbouring countries that will shoot down enemy missiles over Ukraine." Finally, Ukraine's Human Rights Commissioner urged the International Committee of the Red Cross, that's the ICRC, and the United Nations to investigate an image that he said likely showed a Ukrainian prisoner of war killed and dismembered by Russian forces. This is reporting from Reuters. A photograph, probably of a Ukrainian prisoner whose heads and limbs were cut off by the Russians, has appeared online, Dmitry Lubinets said on Telegram. In view of these horrific images, I have urgently appealed to the ICRC and the UN to record yet another human rights violation by the terrorist country. This is still Lubinets. Andrei Kostin, the Prosecutor General, said an urgent investigation accusing Russia of torture had been launched, and of course we must say that Russia denies torture or any other forms of maltreatments of POWs. Just some context, a United Nations Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine said in a report published in March that it had documented credible allegations of executions of at least 32 Ukrainian POWs in 12 separate incidents from December 2023 to February, and that it had independently verified 3 of the incidents. Well, those are the frontline updates. Francis Dearnley, can I come first to you for the political and diplomatic updates that you've been looking at this morning?
Well, thanks, David. It's great to have Francis Farrell again on the podcast. This is what happens when Dom's away. He doesn't just get one Francis, he gets 2. But I'm going to turn first to the continuing fallout from the major political news story last week, namely the prisoner exchange, which saw the return of many prominent journalists and dissidents from Russian prisons. We're hearing some of the first interviews with them now, and already some have stirred controversy, especially among the Ukrainians. Among those that we've heard from, the Pulitzer Prize-winning British-Russian Vladimir Kara-Murza is, as one would expect for those who've been following his writings, one of the most erudite, lucidly describing the conditions in Putin's prisons and in solitary confinement. He said, "It's so easy to lose your mind. You lose sense of time, space, everything, really. You do nothing, speak to no one, go nowhere, day after day." He says he was denied phone calls home and was only allowed to speak to his children twice in over 2 years. He appears noticeably thinner in interviews, he says, from stress, but already he's making comparisons from history and advocating for a shift in specific areas of Western policy. In a rather telling anecdote, he said that when his plane out of Russia was taking off, the FSB guard next to him told him to look out of the window. And he said it was the last time I would ever see my motherland. But I just laughed. I said, "I'm a historian, so I'm sure I will be back in my country, and it will be much quicker than you think." He went on, "Putin cannot be allowed to win this war. Ukraine must win, and there should be more support from Western countries so that happens. Historically," he said, "windows of opportunity for democratic change open only after disastrous military defeat." And that is, of course, a subject we've discussed many, many times on the podcast, not just in the Russian context, but also in wars more broadly. Now, to the controversy. Soon after landing in Germany, Mr. Kara-Murza argued that sanctions in relation to the Ukraine war should be better targeted, sparking immediate uproar from Ukrainians who claimed that his priority on walking free was to soften Russia's punishment for waging war. He said he needs to calibrate that he needs more information, realising that February 2022 has changed a lot. But he wants to know, he said, why a Russian human rights lawyer can't travel to the Baltic states for a conference when a Russian missile containing a Western-made chip can slam into a residential building in Ukraine. To quote him, the responsibility for what the Putin regime is doing there is shared by Russian society, a large part of which close their eyes to the abuses and repression. But let's not forget the responsibility of those Western countries who for years preferred to deal with Putin and do business, knowing full well he was and what he represented. Now, another of the freedmen was Andrei Pivovarov, whose wife said, "I want people to know that Russia is not Putin. Russia is the brave people like my husband who are fighting for the freedom of Russian people, who are against the war and who are looking for the truth." So 2 snippets there that have caused some controversy, as I say. One of the resurrected fault lines in this conflict in recent weeks has been the perennial one between Ukrainians and the so-called Russian opposition. At its heart is really the question of responsibility for the war, whether it is the sole or predominant responsibility of Putin and his acolytes who wield power through fear and propaganda, or whether ordinary Russians too are a major part of the problem due to cultural, historical reasons, and must also be made to feel the impact of Russia's war in order to facilitate change. Now, as you'll know, this is one of the core debates at the end of the Second World War with regards to the Third Reich. So we have been here before. It is not new. And anyone who's interested in that and how the Allies sought to navigate that debate, I would argue it should be essential in the current context, should read the early chapters of Tony Jutt's Post-War for a very thought-provoking summary on this slightly neglected area of contention. Now, to be clear, I don't think that Karamurza and others are saying that ordinary Russians are blameless and therefore should not feel the impact of sanctions. Rather, they're seeking a pragmatic and effective way of achieving victory for Ukraine, which may be at odds with some of the approaches made so far. But just to give a sense of the anger and the controversy amongst Ukrainians and others, Gabrielis Landsbergis, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania, one of the most passionate articulators of the Ukrainian position to EU figures, has tweeted this morning as follows: "I hear talk of ordinary Russians' innocence, but then I see ordinary Russians murdering ordinary Ukrainians. I see ordinary Russian mothers saying goodbye to their ordinary Russian sons and wishing them good luck with their ordinary Russian war crimes. I see ordinary Russians celebrating murder. I see ordinary Russian parents dressing up their ordinary Russian children in military uniforms and painting the letter Z on a cardboard tank costume. I see ordinary Russians coming together to make a huge Z formation in the town square. Ordinary Russia is sick. Healing will be a long and grueling process which can only start when Russia, not just Putin, is defeated. Without a defeat in Ukraine, Russia will just keep spreading. So about those unfair sanctions against ordinary Russians, well, anything which slows down Russia's total war machine will have ordinary Lithuanians' support, whatever victory takes." Now, again, I think that's a slight misconception of the position that's been articulated by Karamurza in particular, but it is still fair to say that there are others who do defend the position there that Gabrielis is attacking. I expect, David, that we will see this debate rumble on, as there has been, of course, extensive criticism by the Ukrainians of what they perceive as the failures of the Russian opposition over many years and on many issues. But just quickly on other updates, continuing allegations of Russian hybrid warfare across Europe this morning, including here in London, with 2 more men charged in connection with an alleged arson attack on Ukrainian-linked businesses in London carried out on behalf of the Wagner Group. They join 5 other defendants who have been charged in connection with the blaze at an industrial unit in Leighton back in March as part of this broader campaign that we've seen numerous alleged incidents in just the last few weeks alone. It's these kind of attacks that numerous intelligence officials have been warning about for some time, and we've reported those on the podcast, taking place across the whole continent as the war in Ukraine rages on. And just staying on intelligence, a final remarkable story and an exclusive to the Telegraph, which has ramifications beyond Britain, is that Britain's nuclear submarine engineers used software that was designed in Russia and Belarus, prevention of military defence rules. Now, the software should have been created by UK-based staff with security clearance, but its design was partially outsourced to developers in Siberia and Minsk. It's an extraordinary story, this. So there are fears that the code was built by the Russian and Belarusian developers and could be exploited to reveal the location of the submarines. And the MOD is considering a very serious security breach, as indeed it appears to be. Now, how on earth did this happen? Well, as I say, if you're really interested in this, we've got a full report on it. In essence, it comes down to government subcontracting work, often alleged to save money, and further issues as well, which is around working from home, as a speculation that some of the people that were subcontracted to work on this were actually working from other countries, namely from Belarus and indeed even in Russia. And this was not happening with the awareness of the MOD. But of course, that is a broader problem when you have subcontracting work, and indeed when you have, you could argue, a sort of working from home culture where people don't necessarily need to report where they're doing the work from. So it speaks to other challenges the security community are facing at the moment. But an extraordinary story, and one that is causing considerable waves this morning here in Britain. But as I say, has ramifications far beyond us, because I think, reading between the lines here, this is quite common among other ministries of defences in Europe and the West. And so something of a warning, I think, for them. As an aside, today the EU unveiled new sanctions against Belarus specifically, targeting 28 individuals over internal repressions and human rights abuses. It came a few days ahead of the 4th anniversary of the 2020 Belarusian presidential election, where Lukashenko cemented his hold on power. The new additions to the sanction list include 2 deputy heads of the main department for combating organised crime and corruption at the Belarusian Justice Ministry. A press release by the Council of the EU said it is one of the main bodies responsible for political persecution in Belarus, including arbitrary and unlawful arrests and ill treatment, including torture of activists and members of civil society. Now, you mentioned James Kilner a moment ago, David. He's also written a very helpful explainer on how Putin turned Belarus into Russia's vassal state over a sustained period. So we'll be sure to add a link in the show notes to that too. But lots going on.
Well, thank you very much, Francis Dearnley, for all of your reporting there. Francis Farrell from the Kyiv Independent, thank you so much for joining us again. I don't quite know where to start. Some of your journalism over the past work has been truly outstanding. And thank you so much for everything you've done to bring the realities of the frontline war to all of the audiences in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. Can we start by talking about your reporting near Toretsk? So that's in between Chasiv Yar and the west of the Donbas. Where did you go and what did you see?
G'day, David. Great to be back, and hello to Francis and everyone else. So I was just north of Toretsk, actually. For people who might be very familiar with the map, it was basically on one of the positions along the canal, the same famous canal that also runs just east of Chasiv Yar, but it starts just north of Toretsk. And so it was an interesting time to be there because obviously the canal itself offers a very advantageous place to defend. And so it wasn't the first choice for Russia to start assaulting where the canal was when they attacked Toretsk. But the issue is that Russian advances have come into Toretsk from around the south of that canal. So while the canal might be holding strong, the danger is for the battalions of that brigade that if their right flank is compromised and overrun by this advance going into Toretsk, then they could be in danger pretty soon. But overall, it was a quiet day. But what was shocking, even though it's not the first time it's happened to me, was that just a few days before the video report was meant to be published from there, we heard from the press officer that a mortar round basically fell right in the trench where we had been chilling basically all day. And one of the guys who was interviewed for the story, including as well as 2 others, were killed basically instantly, and another who was also in the story was seriously wounded. So that's the thing. I mean, Very rarely, and it's just because of the safety situation, very rarely do journalists get access to that very zero-line infantry. And we got there because we were with a press officer who just really doesn't care, and he was ready to take us. But yeah, that's there for a reason. That's the case for a reason. And just being there and hearing that news later was a reminder of how much it's all about the infantry. It's all about those people who are right there on the zero, and their job is to go through this ridiculous lottery of life and death every day. And it's how they can stand that and the conditions that they go in, making their odds better, is what really decides in the end of the day whether a position is going to be held in the face of attack or eventually lost.
Francis, what can you tell us of the people you met? What did you learn about them? And in the video, you describe the position you're in as the eye of the storm, as the fighting rages to the south and to the north. What was the atmosphere like in the trench? What could you tell our listeners about what you saw when you were there?
So again, when I say it's all about the infantry, that's what I mean. You understand who are these people who are holding those lines, and how their makeup has changed and how their own kind of physical and mental state has changed over time. So the position was held by a group of 7 people, I believe, and they had this fluid schedule of a few hours of sentry duty, a few hours of sleep. They were building a new dugout because the previous one had took a direct hit and burned down. But now this was the last opportunity they had to build a nice one out of wood, because getting wood to that front line is now just too difficult with all the drones in the air. And so, it was a mix of some guys who were mobilized. Most people were in their 30s, later 30s, some older, some younger. Some were mobilized, some had been fighting as contract soldiers even before the full-scale invasion. There was one guy, he was the guy who was killed actually, who came out of occupation in Kherson region and signed up to fight because his little village was just right on the front line, and for him there was no point doing anything else because he'd lost everything already, basically. And so you could see in the video, you could see it in the way they were talking to us. This takes a toll on someone. I guess it's no surprise, but just the fact that they are living there basically 24/7. They rotate out for a day every week just to have a shower and buy some supplies or whatever, but that has been their home for almost a year now. And you just understand, okay, so this is the kind of individual infantry unit, and it's up to these guys. There are just thousands of these little groups of people all along this front line of hundreds and hundreds of kilometers long. And when this little team, this little unit on the micro level, when they take some losses, when they come under attack, that's where positions are won and lost. That's where front lines are defended or where they collapse. And you just see that on the human level, which again is something that, because normally journalists get access to artillery or drones or the people working from further back, it doesn't always come across maybe to international audiences.
Well, let's talk about drones a little bit. What was your experience with the Ukrainian drones flying overhead, but also the Russian drones? In the video, there's one moment early on where you can hear a drone, and the soldier guiding you says, "Oh, that's a Russian drone." Could you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah, so that's one thing to understand about the last year of fighting, especially since summer last year, is that it's just changed everything. That now both sides are basically saturated with a supply of drones, of FPV drones, specifically the suicide drones, but also plenty of drones which just civilian drones remade to just drop bombs into trenches. The front line is so saturated with them on both sides, and enough so that they have enough to just hunt individual people, soldiers. That's worth using a suicide drone, for example. They're just always in the air. It was a very big difference from when I was on the zero line in Bakhmut in April or March 2023. Now they're just constantly in the air, and you can tell immediately by the sound that the propellers make whether it's a kind of civilian DJI, probably like Mavic style drone, which could be just looking around, or it could be looking to drop a bomb, or it's one of the FPV suicide drones, because they fly a lot faster, they have a lot higher pitch and kind of more erratic sound. And so it's remarkable how quickly your own kind of ears begins to understand not only the sounds of what kind of drones they are, but where they're flying. And the soldiers could definitely tell when they hear a certain trajectory, then it's probably friendly. But if it's different, for example, if it's going parallel to the Ukrainian trench, then it's probably an enemy drone, because it's looking around for movement, maybe looking to drop a bomb. But they were also saying, of course, that there's this constant cat and mouse game, so that sometimes they fly their drones way back behind enemy lines so that then they can come up from behind and seem like a friendly drone. And it's this whole thing. So yeah, the basic wisdom is, if you hear one, just at least get under a camouflage net so that you can't be seen. But of course, now that they fly with such precision and they can often fly into trenches, into dugouts, it's best to just find the best cover you can.
One of the things you say in your film, Francis, and of course we'll put a link to this in the show notes as well so everybody can watch it, I would highly recommend it, is that, quote, Russia doesn't stand still. And you're talking a little bit about the Russian ability to scale up production of these drones and to some extent match the sort of early Ukrainian successes. Did the soldiers talk much about that? And would you give our audience just a little bit of background as to how this arms race has developed?
Sure. I mean, again, there was the very early frantic phase of the war where, neither side had really integrated drones into their complete kind of fighting system. But things have come a very, very long way since then. And if we fast forward all the way back to early 2023, by then the use of civilian drones for reconnaissance had already proliferated on both sides. Russia, when it comes to larger fixed-wing drones flying deeper behind the front lines, Russia actually had the advantage there from the start, and they still do. But if we talk about the actual zero-line use of drones, Ukraine was always tended to be the one innovating first. So they were the first ones who really got their act together in terms of covering the whole front with reconnaissance, and then experimenting with these bomb-dropping drones, and then, of course, the famous FPV suicide drones, which have now become ubiquitous. And when I say ubiquitous on both sides, at this point, by summer last year, Russia was already scaling up. They very quickly switched on. It's not only the state, it's volunteer organizations making them in garages, just like they do in Ukraine. And that has a huge effect. And people talk about this constant debate of drones versus artillery. Are drones going to replace artillery or not? But I think the first half of 2024, when we did have this really drastic shell hunger in Ukraine, I think that showed that yes, drones can, in many, not all cases, replace artillery in terms of being the primary weapon to use against assaulting infantry and equipment. Because everyone these days will say that in that period especially, Ukraine was definitely saved by their upscale use of FPV drones. And now in almost every brigade, normal fighting brigade in Ukraine, you have a whole battalion, or at least a company, specialized in strike drones. And now, of course, we have also the unmanned systems forces as well. And so now it's good that the artillery is coming back, the shells are coming back as well. It's just good to have more options, more fire options of hitting your enemy. And as we can talk about with the front line, even that's not always enough to stop offensives when you've got this really desperate manpower situation and issues with command coordination that we can see along the front line at the moment. We can talk about that. But yeah, as for the drones, it's just everywhere now. It's the new way of war. And I guess one kind of a data point that might be pretty telling here is that back in October or November 2023, so when the offensive, the large-scale offensive on Avdiivka began. I was at a stabilization point near Avdiivka, and at that point, the surgeon there was telling me that 50% of the wounds were coming in from FPV drones, and the other 50% was artillery, shrapnel, the usual. But by now, in April, when I was in another stabilization point near Chasiv Yar, which is again the site of another high-intensity offensive, at that point they said it was 90%. 90% drones. So you can't argue now that it's just some kind of gimmicky kind of addition to artillery, which is still the king of war. Of course, sometimes these wounds are not so heavy as from a huge piece of shrapnel from a large caliber shell, but you can't ignore figures like that.
Francis, can we go back to something you mentioned there, this issue, these continuing issues with command coordination on the Ukrainian side? It's not something we've done so much on, although we've been aware of it. Could you just sketch out what's going wrong and what people are saying?
Sure. I think it's important to focus more on this, and I will try and do so in my own work in the next couple of weeks or months. It's firstly worth understanding that all of these issues that I'll talk about, they are exacerbated by an overall lack of quality manpower in Ukraine. I'm sure we've all talked about this a lot, about the losses that eventually take their toll, about the loss of really motivated, capable fighters and their replacement with much greener, more poorly trained, not so physically fit, not so motivated soldiers that have been mobilized. That's just the fact of the war, and we know that mobilization is an issue that causes a lot of internal political and social pain in Ukraine, which is trying to be balanced by the country's leadership with the need from the front. But unfortunately, when it comes to the front line, often the losses aren't being replaced in some of these fighting brigades. And when they are replaced, they're unfortunately of lower quality. And so under those conditions, when you have Russia pushing on a lot of sectors all at once, that's when they've understood that they need to look for weak spots and push in unexpected locations. And we see now very clearly what the consequences of that is. The first example that we saw back in April, if you remember, I'm sure lots of our listeners will know the map. In April, there was this breakthrough in the village of Ocheretina, northwest of Avdiivka, which actually happened because of a botched rotation of battalions. And so you can imagine the Ukrainian units are already overstretched. They've already got fewer people manning positions than they would ideally like to have. And when an order comes in from higher command, which might not be necessarily very in tune with the reality on the battlefields, like you guys switch that brigade with that brigade or just a couple of battalions at a time. And that led to this breakthrough northwest of Avdiivka in Ocheretina, which is still continuing today. In fact, it's now, I think, safe to say, more out of control than at any point since that early breakthrough. And the same thing, unfortunately, can be said for the reason why this new front was opened in Toretsk and New York. It's, again, a very well-documented case of one very experienced, capable brigade which had been holding that line, obviously a less intense part of the front line, but they'd been doing their job, holding it for a long time. And because there was this great need in Chasiv Yar to shore up the defense, and the brigade that was at the center of defending Chasiv Yar over spring was very tired, the higher command decided to swap them, take this capable, well-rested brigade out and send them to defend Chasiv Yar, and take this kind of quite exhausted, weaker brigade and put them to this less intense part of the front line. And obviously Russia got a whiff of this, and they saw an opportunity to push through defensive lines that had stayed basically stationary since 2014, basically, and definitely since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And suddenly now we have this new Toretsk sector. We have a new city which is, heavily contested, 2 of them, in fact, together with New York. And there are just more and more of these stories coming up. And so it's a combination of these overall pressures of being overstretched for manpower. It's a combination of decisions by command that are now causing a lot of controversy and discussion. In Ukraine, you have units calling for high command not to fire their brigade commanders because their brigade commanders refused to carry out orders which were deemed to be semi-suicidal. And then you have other soldiers complaining about brigade commanders who do carry out those orders and who pass them these kind of semi-suicidal orders down to the battalions and the companies. So it's a combination of these things, and what's made it worse in recent months is that it seems like Russia has really tuned in to these issues and has learned to press in the weakest points. And the issue with that, of course, is that you have one sector of the front line, for example, which is being defended by a very capable brigade with high combat effectiveness, maybe with good commands, decent amounts of manpower. But if Russia finds a way around them by targeting another sector of the front line where perhaps they didn't attack much before, but now they see an opportunity because they know that there are issues and this is a weaker brigade, then suddenly they can push and surge forward there, which compromises the sector of the front line that the capable brigade had been defending, and they might have units peeled off to fight the fire, and so on. And a combination of these factors was what led to this breakthrough around Ocheretine, also in Toretsk, and now, especially if we look at that Pokrovsk sector, so basically an extension of the Avdiivka offensive from last year. That's the one where it's really out of control in a way that we haven't seen on the front line for a very long time.
Francis, one of the soldiers you interview in your film says, quote, "We're holding on for now." Just zooming out then, looking at this Pokrovsk front as you've done, what do you think of the current situation on the front line there? I mean, it feels like for several weeks now, every single day we start the podcast with updates, and it seems like a sort of relentless advance, which shows no sign of slowing for the moment. How dangerous a moment is this for the Ukrainian army in Donbas?
Yeah, it's pretty hard to understate how dangerous it is, honestly, because if you compare even Toretsk or Chasiv Yar or some of these other areas, they are very tough and there are incremental gains, but you just know that there are capable units defending those areas, and it's not like they're slowly retreating and dealing maximum losses and Russia's taking those a couple of kilometers, maybe a couple of streets at a time at a very high cost. And that's normal. We're used to that kind of situation when Russia's on the offensive. What we see around Pokrovsk is not normal. What we see is, I'm sure, many of our listeners will look at some of these open source maps like Deep State, maybe every few days. And again, as you mentioned, the viewing there is not pleasant. We see that Russians have basically used this kind of raised railway line going between Pokrovsk and Avdiivka to go along there, and that's been the main line of their breakthrough, and then they expand the salient on the sides. And what does that mean for the defending forces? Well, it means that clearly when you're losing positions one after another that quickly, it means that you haven't really organized a defensive line, or what had been organized wasn't of a high quality and was broken. So we know that there were meant to be fortifications going around there, but they were overrun. There was a river, the River Vovcha, which was held up to be a potential setting for a strong line of defense. And again, that has been overrun in the last few weeks. And so you just need to imagine the conditions under which the Ukrainian forces are fighting. They arrive, maybe a new brigade is sent to try and stop the flow, but they arrive and they immediately need to go into kind of poorly prepared positions, which the Russians are already assaulting as they arrive. So it's hard to say what will happen. For me, it is a bit concerning that this isn't higher on the agenda. And we know that the Ukrainian leadership doesn't tend to speak very openly about issues and many defeats along the front line, which is normal, I guess, for a country at war, but it almost feels a little bit surreal when you're focusing on these developments and the biggest news is something completely different, like F-16s, because this is really an issue where we don't know. It's currently not under control, and we don't know when or how it could be stabilized, but at this rate, they are on the way to Pokrovsk. I don't want to give a timeline to it. They could be stopped beforehand, but it's just currently not stable. And if they do make it to Pokrovsk, that does indeed compromise basically Ukraine's defense of southwestern Donetsk Oblast especially, but basically the whole part of the front line. Then they get to a new region, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which has not been a scene of fighting at all in this war. And so it's just important for me to keep this in mind whenever people talk about peace negotiations as well, because it's not obviously the idea that eventually there might be negotiations, there might be a ceasefire, there might be a peace deal, shouldn't be completely taboo. But what's much more important than the fact of negotiations or not, what's much more important is the balance of power on the battlefield when you go into those negotiations. It's two completely different ball games when you go into negotiations with your defense of the front line stable, and you go into one where it's not. So that's, I think, something we all need to keep an eye on. And we need to see, I guess, whether the Ukrainian leadership is eventually able to analyze their own mistakes and do better with what they can. And I don't envy their task, of course, when it comes to that.
Francis, it's Francis. Thanks for your time today and your reporting. Given the precarious situation that you've just described, it is understandable that we've seen recent polling, as I'm sure you have, suggesting that the idea of the negotiations you just referenced is no longer the taboo subject that it once was among quarters of the Ukrainian population. I'm interested in your perspective speaking to soldiers on the front line. Do you get that sense that more of them now welcome the prospect, or at least the idea, of there being some kind of discussion with the Russians? And further to that, do you see there, if not, what the great hope is for Ukraine at the moment? We talk a lot about the negative, pessimistic scenarios, but I'm interested in your perspective on what soldiers what's keeping them going at the front. What is the great hope as to how things might change in a more positive direction? Because we still see a lot of evidence that there is still a deep rooted sense of positivity and optimism amongst certain quarters of the population. So interested in your perspective on those questions.
Thanks. When it comes to morale and thoughts about negotiations, the positions of ordinary soldiers are very, very diverse when it comes to this. Some of them are much more kind of level-headed and clued in about the broader kind of higher level developments, and some of them more emotional and just focused on their little part. So obviously, it's normal, especially among infantry, for some people to think, okay, it would be good to eventually go home and see the end of this war. That's obviously something everyone wants. But at the same time, on a more emotional level, for when it comes to talk about the ceding of territory or even retreating from certain positions to be in a better place. If you take the case of Robotyna in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, such high losses were suffered to take that area. And now you ask a soldier there, how would you feel about retreating from that area? And they just would be like, nah, we just couldn't. So many people gave everything for that. And so again, I think at the end of the day, like the one kind of common thread is that among those people who understand what this fight is about, among soldiers, I mean, is that things can get very, very bad. Things could get worse, but there's no choice because the maximalist aims of Russia, they're aimed to come to our homes, to torture, to rape, to eliminate everything Ukrainian hasn't changed. And if we don't stop them here, then they'll come to my home in Cherkasy or Dnipro or Odessa or even Lviv. So that's what keeps them going.
My next question is just relating to what you were describing earlier on, the changing face of war. And one often hears, of course, comparisons with the First and the Second World War in terms of the battlefield that we're seeing at the moment, or indeed earlier on in the war. And I just want to return to that point because, of course, you're at the front. And I'm guessing what you're going to say, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, that some of those comparisons, particularly about the First World War and the kind of attritional and artillery-based war, are very, very antiquated in our understanding about the battlefield at the moment, that we are actually now in, not just hypothetically, but we are in a future war type of scenario with the proliferation of drones. I just wondered if you could give a sense of that, if you agree, and how we need to catch up in our understanding. I mean, what kind of technologies need to be being prioritised in terms of just facing this new challenge, if indeed that is the world that we are now in?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, it is. I guess there's nothing that really summarizes what this new face of war looks like more than the FPV drone itself. So this very cheap, very small, and very easy to make high precision weapon, which if you put the right kind of antennas on it and you attach it, if you use it together with another drone that's retranslating the signal, it is now a very high precision weapon that can hunt, again, an individual soldier, let alone a car or a tank, or basically anything at a range of upwards of 10, 15 kilometers. So in that itself is everything you need to know about what this looks like. It's something that any military in the world would be mad not to look at and at least prepared to counter, but also employ itself. Because when you have, again, a saturated front line with plenty of eyes in the sky seeing any movement, and then little crews of these FPV drones ready to go and hit those things at a moment's notice, it does indeed change how war is fought. What the counter argument is that these are just the new conditions in which both of these armies are fighting, but at the end of the day, it's still a war of front lines, of territory, of trenches, of assaulting, and of defending them. And so in some ways, I'm not actually that opposed to these World War I comparisons still having some relevance in this day and age. And one thing, for example, which I think a lot of people might get wrong is this idea of the stalemate. So this idea of the fact that, well, both sides are dug in and both sides defending and attacking is really difficult these days. Therefore, it seems like it's a stalemate. No one can achieve their military aims on the ground. But you have a very fierce war of attrition where both sides are doing everything they can to degrade and destroy the enemy military. And when that goes far enough, that's when stalemates can be broken and breakthroughs can be made.
Coming up, we hear Francis and Francis's final thoughts. Thank you so much, Francis, Farrell, for your time. Thank you, Francis, there for your questions. Let's move then to our final thoughts, as I do see that time marches on. Francis Dearnley, would you like to go first?
Thanks, David, and thanks again, Francis, for your time today. I quoted earlier on Vladimir Kara-Murza, one, of course, of the prisoners from Russia released last week in that exchange. And I was listening to an interview that he gave with Sky News earlier on in the weekend. And he made an interesting point, I thought, which bears repeating. It's something we have addressed before on the podcast, but he talked about in the specific context of the prisoner exchange that this is, of course, a difficult ethical debate. He said that many innocent people have been exchanged for many criminals by any international standard of criminality. These are violent individuals who've committed murders and worse on foreign soil. But he said that part of a democracy is to acknowledge the difficulty of ethical decisions, that process that can often lead to frustration and confusion and debate and disagreement on various different sides is part of what makes democracy great, that at times we can be incredibly frustrated by it. And goodness knows we've had enough criticisms of the democratic decisions made by European leaders on this podcast. But that is part of what makes democracies ultimately better systems, arguably, because they are able to grapple with major issues and ultimately, hopefully, lead to the right decisions made through rational processes. At least that is the theory. And it can be slow, it can be agonising, but it's part of what makes democracies more long-lasting and ultimately far more peaceful societies. As he says, it's very easy under dictatorships for leaders to just click their fingers and for things to be done for good or for ill. And in war, we can see advantages of that kind of decision making. But ultimately, we can also see dictatorships make disastrous decisions as a result of that non-democratic decision making. And one could argue that this entire war is an example of that from the Russian perspective. For all of the gains that we've talked about today that Russia is making on the battlefield, albeit minor ones, they do add up. Nonetheless, this is still disastrous from the 3-day conflict that Russia sought to achieve. And when one zooms out, it'll be that story, arguably, that historians will most likely report on, depending on how this war ends, because it has been a hugely costly conflict on every metric for Russia. And there is still no guarantee that they will be the net benefiters of it. But of course, that remains in Western hands. But as I say, an interesting point, I think, that Mirza raises, that ultimately we may critique democracy and we may get frustrated with sometimes decisions that democracies make, such as the prisoner exchanges. And there is controversy in Germany at the moment because of some of those that have been let out. But that knotty debate is part of what makes democracies great. It is not a failing, it is a strength. And we lose that realisation at our peril in democracies. So hopefully it will be something that we always bear in mind at the darker moments of this conflict.
Thank you very much, Francis Dearnley, Francis Farrell, as our guest. First of all, thank you so much for all of your time. And would you like the very final words for today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. Yeah, maybe what I've said today is not, again, painting a very kind of bright picture of where the war is going, but I just want to round it out by saying, on the one hand, yeah, nothing has changed in terms of the complete validity and necessity of this fight and the righteousness of this fight. But when it comes to what's actually happening on the battlefield, which is always the most important part of this whole equation, yeah, things are changing. It's no longer this paradigm where we were waiting for the next Ukrainian offensive to liberate more territory. It's gone back into a fight for survival that is almost more fraught and brutal than it has been before. But in that, when we're talking about morale and when we're talking about what needs to be done, that shouldn't change anything in terms of understanding, in terms of giving up or perhaps pushing for some negotiations in circumstances that will only make the situation worse. It's very simple. We just need to keep working, but doing so with a strong connection to reality. Doing our job as journalists and as observers when it comes to what's being done by the leadership and looking at whether that's in connection with reality, whether we're talking about Kyiv or Ukraine's partners, just doing our best to stick with the truth and stick with an honest assessment of what's going on. Because if one doesn't, then 100% you're just going to pay a higher cost for it later.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.